Your brain knows English, but when it's time to speak, your mouth stays silent. You understand conversations. You recognize the words. You even know the answer in your mind. Yet, the moment you try to say it out loud, the sentence disappears and the words refuse to come out. It feels like your brain and your voice are not working together. The truth is, your brain already has the English knowledge inside it, but it has not been trained to release those words naturally in real conversations. In this training session, you are going to reconnect your thoughts with your voice. You will learn how to stop blocking your own speech, how to unlock the words your brain already knows, and how to train your mind to speak English smoothly and confidently. By the end of this practice, your brain will begin sending words to your mouth faster, clearer, and more naturally, so you can finally speak the English that already exists inside your mind. Chapter 1: The Strange Gap Between Knowing and Speaking. Something confusing often happens when people try to speak English. A person can listen to a question and understand it clearly. The meaning is obvious, the topic is familiar, and the brain recognizes the words that were spoken. Inside the mind, everything seems clear. However, when it is time to answer, the voice becomes quiet. The sentence that should appear suddenly feels difficult to form. The mind knows the idea, yet the words refuse to come out easily. This strange gap between knowing and speaking surprises many people. Understanding a language and speaking a language are not exactly the same skill. The brain processes them in different ways. When someone listens, the brain only needs to recognize words and connect them with meaning. This process is similar to recognizing a familiar face or understanding a picture. The information is received and interpreted, but the brain does not need to create anything new. Speaking requires a different type of mental activity. When someone speaks, the brain must create language instead of recognizing it. Ideas must be turned into words, words must be organized into sentences, and those sentences must be spoken clearly and quickly. This process requires more effort because the brain is producing language rather than simply understanding it. Another reason for this gap is how language is stored in memory. Many people spend a lot of time listening, reading, and studying vocabulary. These activities help the brain understand English very well. The knowledge becomes stored in memory, but it remains passive knowledge. Passive knowledge means the brain can recognize the information when it appears, but it may not immediately produce it during speech. Active knowledge is different. Active knowledge allows the brain to use words quickly during conversations. Building this ability requires practice in speaking, thinking, and forming sentences. Without enough practice in these areas, the brain continues recognizing English but struggles to express it. Pressure during conversations also increases this gap. When someone asks a question, the brain knows that a response is expected quickly. This pressure can cause hesitation. The mind begins searching carefully for the correct words and grammar. While this searching happens, the conversation continues moving forward, and the speaker may feel that the mind has suddenly stopped working. Another factor is the habit of translating thoughts from another language. When a person hears English, the brain understands it, but when creating a response, the mind may return to the native language to form the idea. After that, the brain tries to translate the idea back into English. This extra step slows down speaking and makes the gap between knowing and speaking feel even larger. Confidence also affects this situation. When someone doubts their speaking ability, the brain becomes cautious. It begins by checking every word before speaking. This careful checking slows the process and creates hesitation. Instead of allowing ideas to flow naturally, the brain becomes focused on avoiding mistakes. The good news is that this gap can be reduced with the right type of practice. When the brain begins forming thoughts directly in English and practicing simple spoken responses, the pathway between knowing and speaking becomes stronger. The mind gradually learns to move from understanding to expression more smoothly. Small exercises, such as describing daily actions, answering simple questions, or speaking short sentences, help the brain strengthen this connection. Each time the brain successfully turns a thought into spoken English, the gap becomes smaller. The brain becomes more comfortable producing language. Words begin appearing faster, sentences become easier to form, and conversations start to feel more natural. The strange gap between knowing and speaking slowly disappears as the brain learns to use English not only for understanding, but also for expressing ideas clearly and confidently. Chapter 2. The Invisible Wall. Blocking your words. There are moments when a person wants to speak English but feels something holding the words back. The idea is clear in the mind. The person understands the topic and even knows the vocabulary. Yet, when it is time to speak, the sentence does not come out easily. It feels as if there is an invisible wall between the brain and the voice. This wall is not something physical, but it is a mental barrier that stops thoughts from turning into spoken language. This invisible wall is created by several small habits inside the brain. One of the most common habits is overthinking. When someone prepares to speak, the mind begins checking every part of the sentence. It questions whether the grammar is correct, whether the pronunciation sounds right, and whether there might be a better word to use. While the brain is busy checking all these details, the opportunity to speak begins to fade. The person becomes silent, even though the idea was already clear. Another part of this wall is the habit of translating. The brain understands English, but when forming an answer, it may return to the native language to organize the idea. After building the thought there, the brain tries to convert it back into English. This extra process slows the mind and creates hesitation. Conversations move quickly, and when the brain spends too much time translating, the words feel blocked. Fear can also strengthen this invisible wall. When someone worries about making mistakes or sounding incorrect, the brain becomes cautious. Instead of allowing words to flow naturally, the mind begins protecting itself from embarrassment. It chooses silence rather than risk. This reaction creates tension, and tension makes speaking feel even harder. Confidence plays a powerful role in breaking this barrier. When the brain feels relaxed and confident, it focuses on sharing ideas rather than avoiding errors. Words begin to appear more easily because the mind is not trying to control every detail. The speaker becomes more willing to express simple thoughts instead of waiting for the perfect sentence. Another reason this wall appears is lack of speaking practice. The brain may understand English through listening and reading, but it has not had enough experience producing sentences out loud. Without regular speaking practice, The connection between thoughts and speech remains weak. The mind knows the language, but it has not trained the pathway that allows those ideas to become spoken words. Training the brain to remove this invisible wall requires consistent and simple practice. One helpful method is describing everyday actions. When the brain turns daily activities into English sentences, it begins strengthening the pathway between ideas and speech. Even short sentences such as describing what you are doing or what you see around you can help the brain practice expressing thoughts naturally. Another useful exercise is speaking simple responses to imaginary questions. Asking yourself questions and answering them out loud trains the brain to react quickly. The mind becomes familiar with forming sentences without hesitation. Listening to natural English conversations also helps weaken this barrier. When the brain hears how people speak naturally, it learns the rhythm and structure of the language. These patterns become easier to use while speaking. With time and practice, the invisible wall begins to disappear. The brain becomes more comfortable expressing ideas, and the connection between thought and voice becomes stronger. Words start appearing faster, and speaking feels less stressful. The speaker realizes that the barrier was never permanent. It was simply a habit that the brain had developed. Once the mind learns to trust its ability to communicate, that invisible wall slowly fades away, allowing thoughts to move freely from the mind into spoken English. Chapter 3. Why your brain hesitates before speaking. When a person tries to speak English, there is often a short moment where the brain pauses before the words appear. The question is understood, the idea is present in the mind, yet the response does not come out immediately. This hesitation can feel frustrating because it seems like the brain suddenly slows down at the exact moment when speaking is required. Understanding why this hesitation happens is an important step toward improving fluency. The brain is responsible for several tasks during a conversation. It must understand what the other person said, decide what idea it wants to express, choose the correct words, organize those words into a sentence, and send the message to the mouth so it can be spoken clearly. All of these actions happen in a very short time. When the brain is not used to performing these steps quickly in English, it naturally slows down to manage the process. One reason for hesitation is the habit of searching for perfect words. The mind may know several possible expressions, but becomes uncertain about which one is best. Instead of selecting a simple sentence and speaking, the brain keeps comparing different options. While this internal search continues, the conversation moves forward and the speaker remains silent. Another cause of hesitation is the mental pressure to avoid mistakes. When someone is worried about grammar, pronunciation, or vocabulary, the brain begins checking each part of the sentence before speaking. This careful checking feels helpful, but it actually delays the response. The mind becomes focused on correctness instead of communication. Translation can also create hesitation. The brain may first form the idea in another language and then try to convert that idea into English. This extra step takes time and interrupts the natural flow of speech. By the time the translation is finished, the speaker may feel that the moment to answer has already passed. Confidence also influences how quickly the brain responds. When someone feels comfortable with their English ability, the mind reacts faster because it trusts its own knowledge. When confidence is low, the brain becomes cautious. It hesitates because it is unsure whether the sentence will sound correct. Another factor is speaking experience. Listening and reading build understanding, but speaking requires practice in producing language. Without enough opportunities to speak, the brain remains unfamiliar with forming sentences quickly. The mind knows the information, yet it has not trained the pathway that turns ideas into spoken words. The brain can overcome hesitation through consistent practice. When a person regularly forms simple sentences and answers questions aloud, the mind becomes faster at connecting thoughts with language. Each successful response strengthens the pathway between thinking and speaking. Practicing short and clear responses helps the brain develop speed. Simple phrases allow the mind to communicate ideas without complicated thinking. As these patterns become familiar, the brain begins responding automatically in similar situations. Listening to natural conversations also helps reduce hesitation. When the brain hears how others respond quickly and simply, it begins recognizing common patterns. These patterns provide examples that the mind can use during speaking. Hesitation becomes shorter and less noticeable. The brain grows more comfortable with producing language and stops searching for perfect sentences. Words begin appearing faster because the mind trusts its ability to communicate. Speaking fluently does not mean never pausing. Even fluent speakers sometimes pause to think about what they want to say. The difference is that their brain has practiced responding often enough that hesitation does not stop the conversation. As the brain continues practicing, it learns to respond more naturally. Ideas move from the mind into words with greater speed and confidence. The hesitation that once blocked communication slowly disappears, allowing speech to flow more smoothly during conversations. Chapter 4. The translation habit that slows your voice. A common obstacle that affects speaking speed is the habit of translating thoughts from one language into English before speaking. This habit feels natural because the brain has spent many years thinking in a familiar language. When someone hears English, the meaning may be understood quickly. However, when forming a response, the brain often returns to the native language to build the idea. After creating the idea there, the mind begins converting that thought into English words. This extra step slows the speaking process and makes communication feel difficult. The brain is designed to respond quickly during conversation. People expect answers within seconds. When translation becomes part of the thinking process, the brain must complete several tasks before speaking. It must understand the question, move the idea into the native language, build the response there, and finally translate the sentence into English. Each step takes time. While this is happening, the conversation continues moving forward. Because of this delay, the speaker may feel pressure to answer faster. The mind begins rushing through the translation process, which often creates confusion. Words may be forgotten, sentences may feel incomplete, and the speaker may suddenly feel that the mind has gone blank. The real problem is not a lack of knowledge, but the extra mental work created by translation. Another difficulty with translation is that languages organize ideas differently. Sentence structures, word order, and expressions vary between languages. When the brain tries to translate directly, the result may not match natural English patterns. The speaker may pause again to adjust the sentence, which adds even more delay to the conversation. Translation also divides attention inside the brain. Instead of focusing on the message that needs to be communicated, the mind becomes busy converting words between two language systems. This split attention reduces speaking speed and increases hesitation. Natural communication works differently. Fluent speakers usually think directly in the language they are using. Their ideas appear in English, and the brain turns those ideas into sentences without switching languages. Because there is no translation step, responses appear faster and conversations move smoothly. Developing this ability requires practice that trains the brain to connect ideas directly with English words. Simple descriptions of daily actions can help build this connection. When someone notices what they are doing and describes it in English, the mind begins associating thoughts with English expressions. Statements such as describing what is happening in the room or explaining a small task strengthen this pathway. Listening to natural English also helps the brain recognize how ideas are normally expressed. As the mind becomes familiar with common patterns, it becomes easier to form sentences without translating them from another language. Another useful practice involves speaking short phrases that are used frequently in conversation. Expressions such as giving opinions, agreeing, or describing plans can become automatic responses when repeated often. These patterns allow the brain to respond quickly without building a sentence from the beginning every time. Confidence plays an important role in reducing the translation habit. When someone trusts their ability to communicate using simple language, the brain becomes more willing to respond directly in English. Instead of searching for the perfect translation, the mind focuses on expressing the idea clearly. The brain learns that translation is not necessary for communication. Thoughts begin forming directly in English, and the extra mental steps disappear. The connection between thinking and speaking becomes stronger, allowing sentences to appear more naturally. When the translation habit weakens, speaking becomes easier and faster. The mind responds more quickly because it is no longer switching between languages. Words appear more smoothly, and conversations feel more comfortable. Breaking the translation habit is an important step toward fluency. As the brain becomes accustomed to thinking directly in English, the voice begins to follow those thoughts naturally. Over time, speaking stops feeling like a complicated process and becomes a simple way of sharing ideas with others. Chapter 5. Reconnecting your thoughts with your voice. Speaking a language smoothly requires a strong connection between the mind and the voice. When this connection works well, thoughts move naturally from the brain into spoken words. However, during language learning, this connection sometimes becomes weak. A person may have clear ideas inside the mind but still struggle to express them out loud. The brain understands what it wants to say, yet the voice remains silent or hesitant. Rebuilding this connection is an important step toward confident English speaking. The brain and the voice must work together as a team. The brain creates ideas and organizes them into language, while the voice delivers those ideas to others. When these two systems are not fully connected, the speaking process feels slow and uncomfortable. The mind may hesitate while searching for words, and the voice waits for clear instructions before speaking. This disconnection often happens when learning focuses mainly on reading and listening. These skills help the brain understand English, but they do not always train the voice to produce the language. The mind may recognize vocabulary easily, Yet the muscles used for speaking are not practiced enough. Because of this, the pathway between thought and speech remains weak. Strengthening this pathway requires practice that involves both thinking and speaking at the same time. One effective way to do this is by expressing simple thoughts aloud. When the brain forms a sentence and immediately sends it to the voice, the connection between thinking and speaking becomes stronger. Even short phrases help build this habit. Daily activities provide many opportunities to practice this skill. When performing simple tasks such as preparing food, organizing items, or walking outside, the mind can describe each action in English. Saying sentences like describing what is happening at that moment encourages the brain to send ideas directly to the voice. These small exercises train the brain to respond quickly. Another useful approach involves asking and answering simple questions out loud. Questions about daily plans, opinions, or observations help the brain practice forming responses. When the voice expresses those responses immediately, the pathway between thoughts and speech becomes more active. Listening and repeating natural English expressions can also help reconnect the voice with the brain. Hearing how sentences sound and repeating them strengthens pronunciation and rhythm. This practice allows the voice to become more comfortable producing English sounds. Confidence also influences this connection. When someone feels relaxed while speaking, the brain sends messages to the voice more easily. If the speaker becomes worried about mistakes, the brain begins checking every detail before allowing the voice to speak. This hesitation weakens the connection and slows the speaking process. Using simple sentences helps the brain reconnect with the voice more effectively. Short and clear expressions allow the mind to communicate ideas without complicated thinking. As the brain becomes more comfortable sending ideas directly to speech. Words appear faster and sentences flow more smoothly because the connection between thinking and speaking has grown stronger. The speaker begins to notice a change. Thoughts no longer remain trapped inside the mind. Instead, they move quickly into spoken language. Conversations become easier because the brain trusts its ability to communicate clearly. Reconnecting thoughts with the voice transforms the speaking experience. English stops feeling like a difficult task and begins to feel like a natural way of sharing ideas. The brain produces the thought, the voice expresses it, and communication becomes smooth and confident. Chapter 6. Training your brain to release words instantly. One of the biggest challenges in speaking English is not understanding the language, but releasing the words quickly when it is time to speak. The brain may already know many words and sentences, yet during a conversation, those words sometimes stay trapped inside the mind. The person understands what they want to say, but the response takes too long to appear. Training the brain to release words instantly is an important step towards smooth and confident speaking. The human brain works by building pathways through repetition. Every time a person thinks, listens, or speaks in English, small connections inside the brain become stronger. These connections allow the brain to access words faster in the future. When a person rarely speaks, these pathways remain weak. The brain knows the information, but it cannot reach it quickly enough during conversation. Instant word release happens when the brain becomes comfortable producing language without hesitation. Instead of searching carefully for the perfect word, the mind begins choosing simple expressions that communicate the idea clearly. This change allows sentences to appear more quickly because the brain is no longer trying to control every detail. A useful way to train this ability is through quick response exercises. When the brain is asked a simple question, it should answer immediately using short sentences. These responses do not need to be complex. Even basic expressions help strengthen the connection between thinking and speaking. The goal is speed and clarity rather than perfection. Another helpful method involves describing daily activities while they are happening. The brain observes an action and immediately forms a sentence about it. This practice encourages the mind to respond without delay. Over time, the brain becomes used to turning observations into spoken language quickly. Listening also plays an important role in building instant responses. When the brain hears natural English conversations regularly, it begins recognizing common sentence patterns. These patterns become stored in memory as ready-made structures. During speaking, the brain can use these patterns to create sentences faster. Repeating useful phrases helps the brain store language in an accessible way. Expressions used frequently in conversations become easy to recall. When these phrases are practiced often, the brain can release them instantly during real interactions. Confidence also affects how quickly words appear. When the mind feels relaxed, it allows language to flow more naturally. Fear or self-doubt causes the brain to slow down because it begins checking every word before speaking. Reducing this pressure helps the brain trust its ability to communicate. Another powerful exercise involves speaking aloud during practice sessions. Saying sentences out loud strengthens the connection between the brain and the muscles used for speech. This practice makes it easier for the mind to send language signals to the voice quickly. Visualization can also support instant responses. Imagining simple conversation situations and answering them in English trains the brain to react naturally. These mental exercises prepare the mind for real conversations because the brain becomes familiar with responding quickly. With regular practice, the brain gradually stops holding words back. Instead of pausing and searching, the mind begins releasing language automatically. Sentences become easier to form because the brain has practiced the process many times. This improvement does not happen suddenly. It develops step by step as the brain gains more experience using English actively. Each moment of speaking practice strengthens the ability to respond quickly. The speaker begins to notice that words appear faster and conversations feel smoother. The mind no longer feels blocked when it is time to speak. The brain understands the message, forms the response, and releases the words almost immediately. Training the brain to release words instantly allows communication to feel natural and confident. Ideas move freely from the mind to the voice, and the speaker becomes comfortable sharing thoughts in English without hesitation. Chapter 7: Turning Silent Thoughts into Spoken Sentences. Every person has thousands of thoughts moving through the mind during the day. These thoughts may be about daily activities, plans, feelings, observations, or simple reactions to what is happening around them. The brain is constantly active, forming ideas and processing information. However, when learning English, many of these thoughts remain silent. The ideas exist clearly inside the mind, but they are not expressed in spoken English. Learning to transform these silent thoughts into spoken sentences is a powerful step toward fluent communication. The brain naturally creates ideas before it creates language. A person might notice something interesting, think about a future plan, or react to a situation. The thought appears first as a concept or image in the mind. Language then gives that idea a form that can be shared with others. When someone practices turning thoughts into English sentences, the brain becomes better at connecting ideas directly with language. This process begins with simple awareness. Paying attention to everyday thoughts creates opportunities to practice speaking. When the brain notices a thought, it can immediately try to express that idea in English. The sentence does not need to be long or complex. Even short statements help train the brain to move from thinking to speaking. Daily life provides endless material for this type of practice. Observations about the environment can easily become sentences. A person might notice the weather, the movement of people, or something happening in a room. These observations can quickly turn into English statements describing what is seen or experienced. Each time this happens, the brain strengthens the connection between thoughts and language. Another helpful approach involves speaking about actions as they happen. When someone is performing a task, the brain can describe each step in English. This might involve talking about preparing food, organizing items, or completing work. By describing actions in real time, the mind practices forming sentences without delay. Feelings and reactions can also become spoken thoughts. The brain often responds emotionally to situations throughout the day. Expressing these feelings in English helps the mind practice using language to describe internal experiences. Simple sentences about emotions or opinions strengthen the ability to communicate naturally. The more frequently the brain practices expressing thoughts out loud, the more comfortable it becomes with producing language. Instead of keeping ideas silent, the mind learns to release them through speech. This practice gradually reduces hesitation because the brain becomes used to forming sentences quickly. Another important benefit of this practice is that it reduces dependence on translation. When someone expresses thoughts directly in English, the brain no longer needs to convert ideas from another language. Thoughts and English words begin to appear together, making communication faster and smoother. Listening to natural English conversations can also support this training. Hearing how other people express ideas helps the brain learn patterns of speech. These patterns become useful models that the mind can use while forming its own sentences. Confidence grows when silent thoughts begin turning into spoken language. The speaker starts realizing that expressing ideas in English is possible without complicated grammar or perfect vocabulary. Simple language is often enough to communicate clearly. The brain becomes more comfortable, transforming thoughts into sentences automatically. The gap between thinking and speaking becomes smaller because the mind practices this connection regularly. Speaking English begins to feel natural. Thoughts no longer remain silent inside the mind. Instead, they flow outward through clear and simple sentences. The brain produces ideas, the voice expresses them, and communication becomes smooth and confident. Turning silent thoughts into spoken sentences is one of the most effective ways to develop speaking ability. Each moment of practice strengthens the pathway between thinking and speaking, allowing the brain to use English more freely in everyday conversations. Chapter 8. The confidence trigger your brain needs. Confidence plays a powerful role in the way the brain uses language. When a person feels confident while speaking English, the mind becomes relaxed and open to communication. Words appear more easily, sentences form faster, and the voice begins to express ideas more naturally. When confidence is missing, the opposite happens. The brain becomes cautious, speech slows down, and hesitation begins to appear before every sentence. The brain reacts strongly to emotional signals. When someone believes they can communicate successfully, the mind focuses on sharing ideas rather than worrying about mistakes. This mental state allows the brain to access vocabulary quickly and build sentences smoothly. Confidence creates a positive environment inside the mind where language can flow freely. When confidence is low, the brain begins protecting itself from possible embarrassment. The mind starts questioning every word before it is spoken. Thoughts such as whether the grammar is correct, whether the pronunciation sounds right, or whether the sentence might be wrong begin to appear. This constant checking interrupts the natural speaking process and creates hesitation. The moment when confidence activates can be described as a trigger inside the brain. Once the mind feels safe expressing ideas, the speaking process becomes easier. The brain stops blocking words and allows sentences to appear naturally. This change often surprises people because they realize that they knew the words all along, but were holding them back. Confidence grows through repeated positive experiences. Each time someone successfully speaks a sentence and communicates an idea, the brain receives proof that speaking is possible. These experiences strengthen the belief that English can be used comfortably. Over time, this belief becomes stronger and hesitation begins to disappear. Another way confidence develops is through simple communication. Many people believe they must use advanced vocabulary or perfect grammar in order to speak well. In reality, clear and simple sentences are often enough to share ideas. When the brain learns that simple language works, the pressure to speak perfectly becomes smaller. This relaxed approach helps the mind respond more freely. Listening to natural conversations also supports confidence. When the brain hears how people communicate in real situations, it notices that speech is rarely perfect. Even fluent speakers pause, correct themselves, or use simple words. Understanding this helps the mind realize that communication is about meaning rather than perfection. Practice is another powerful trigger for confidence. Speaking regularly trains the brain to become comfortable with using English. The more often someone forms sentences and expresses ideas, the more familiar the speaking process becomes. Familiarity reduces fear and allows the brain to react more naturally during conversations. Visualization can also strengthen confidence. Imagining successful conversations prepares the brain for real communication. When the mind pictures speaking clearly and sharing ideas comfortably, it becomes easier to recreate that experience in real life. Supportive environments also help activate the confidence trigger. Speaking with patient listeners who focus on understanding rather than correcting mistakes creates a positive experience. The brain begins associating English communication with encouragement instead of fear. As confidence continues growing, the brain stops holding words back. sentences begin forming quickly, and ideas move more smoothly from the mind into speech. The speaker becomes more comfortable, participating in conversations and expressing opinions. The confidence trigger does not require perfect knowledge of English. It requires trust in the ability to communicate with the language that is already known. Once the brain learns to trust this ability, speaking becomes easier and more natural. When confidence is active, the mind shifts its focus from worrying about mistakes to sharing ideas clearly. Words appear faster, hesitation becomes smaller, and conversations feel more comfortable. The brain begins allowing language to flow freely, helping the speaker communicate with greater ease and clarity. Chapter 9. Breaking the fear of speaking out loud. Speaking a new language in front of others can create a strong feeling of fear. Even when a person understands English and knows many words, the moment they need to speak out loud, the mind can suddenly become nervous. The heart may beat faster, the thoughts may feel scattered, and the voice may hesitate. This fear often appears because the brain is worried about making mistakes or being judged by others. Fear is a natural reaction created by the brain to protect us from uncomfortable situations. When the brain believes something might cause embarrassment or criticism, it tries to avoid that situation. In language learning, this protective reaction can prevent someone from speaking freely. Instead of focusing on communication, the mind becomes focused on avoiding mistakes. When fear is present, the brain behaves differently. The mind becomes tense, and this tension makes it harder to remember words or form sentences. Vocabulary that was easy to recall during practice may suddenly disappear when someone tries to speak in front of others. This happens because the brain is using its energy to manage stress rather than focusing on language. Another effect of fear is silence. When the brain believes speaking might lead to embarrassment, it chooses to stay quiet. Silence feels safer than making a mistake. However, this reaction prevents the brain from gaining the experience it needs to improve speaking ability. Breaking this fear requires understanding that mistakes are a natural part of learning any language. Communication does not require perfect grammar or perfect pronunciation. The main goal of language is to share ideas and understand others. Small errors rarely stop communication from happening. One helpful way to reduce fear is by practicing speaking in a comfortable environment. When someone speaks out loud during personal practice, the brain becomes familiar with producing English sounds and sentences. This repeated exposure helps the mind feel more relaxed when speaking. Another useful approach involves starting with simple sentences. Short expressions are easier for the brain to produce and require less mental effort. As the brain becomes comfortable with these sentences, it gradually gains confidence to form longer ideas. Listening to natural conversations can also reduce fear. When the brain hears how people actually speak in everyday situations, it realizes that language is often simple and imperfect. This understanding helps remove the unrealistic expectation of speaking perfectly. Positive experiences with communication also weaken fear. Each time someone successfully shares an idea in English, the brain receives proof that speaking is possible. These experiences gradually replace anxiety with confidence. Support from friendly listeners can also make a difference. When people respond with patience and encouragement, The brain begins to associate speaking English with positive interactions rather than stress. Another effective method involves focusing on the message instead of the mistakes. When the speaker concentrates on sharing an idea clearly, the brain becomes less concerned about grammar details. This shift allows the mind to express thoughts more naturally. With regular practice, the brain learns that speaking English does not need to be frightening. The protective reaction becomes weaker because the mind realizes that communication is safe. Words begin appearing more easily, and the voice becomes more comfortable expressing ideas. Breaking the fear of speaking out loud opens the door to real communication. Once the brain stops avoiding speaking situations, it gains the experience needed to improve fluency. Conversations become opportunities for growth rather than moments of anxiety. As confidence increases, the speaker begins to enjoy using English. Ideas move from the mind into spoken language more freely, and the voice becomes stronger with each conversation. The fear that once created silence gradually fades, allowing communication to become natural and confident. Chapter 10. Daily Brain Exercises for Natural Speaking. Speaking English naturally does not happen only by studying rules or memorizing vocabulary. The brain needs regular practice that trains it to think, respond, and speak smoothly. Just like physical muscles become stronger through exercise, the brain also becomes stronger when it practices using English every day. These small daily exercises help the mind build faster connections between ideas and spoken language. The brain learns best when practice is consistent. Short exercises repeated throughout the day are often more effective than long study sessions that happen only occasionally. Each time the brain forms a sentence in English, it strengthens the pathway that connects thoughts to speech. Over time, these pathways become faster and more reliable, allowing the mind to respond more naturally during conversations. One of the simplest exercises involves describing what you see around you. The brain constantly notices objects, people, and actions in the environment. Turning these observations into English sentences trains the mind to express ideas quickly. When the brain sees a door, a person walking, or a car passing by, it can quietly describe the situation in English. These small sentences may seem simple, but they help the brain practice thinking directly in English. Another useful exercise involves describing daily actions. Every activity during the day creates an opportunity for language practice. While preparing food, organizing items, or completing tasks, the brain can describe each action in English. Speaking about what is happening in the moment helps the mind connect real experiences with language. This type of practice trains the brain to produce sentences without hesitation. Asking and answering simple questions is also a powerful brain exercise. The mind can ask itself questions about plans, opinions, or daily activities and then respond immediately in English. This practice helps the brain become comfortable forming answers quickly. Over time, the mind becomes familiar with responding to common questions during real conversations. Listening to natural English is another important part of daily training. When the brain hears how sentences are spoken in real conversations, it begins to recognize patterns in pronunciation, rhythm, and structure. These patterns become stored in memory and help the brain create similar sentences when speaking. Repeating useful phrases can also strengthen speaking ability. Short expressions that are commonly used in conversations become easier to recall when practiced regularly. When these phrases are repeated many times, the brain learns to use them automatically. Reading simple sentences out loud is another helpful exercise. When the brain sees words and speaks them at the same time, it strengthens the connection between understanding and speaking. This activity also improves pronunciation and speaking confidence. Visualization exercises can also help train the brain. Imagining everyday situations, such as meeting someone, asking a question, or explaining an idea, encourages the mind to practice forming sentences. The brain begins to prepare responses for situations that might appear during real conversations. Consistency is the key to making these exercises effective. Practicing a little every day allows the brain to build strong language pathways. Each moment of practice teaches the mind that speaking English is a natural activity. These daily exercises transform the way the brain processes language. Thoughts begin appearing directly in English, and sentences form more quickly. Conversations become easier because the mind has practiced similar situations many times before. Daily brain exercises help remove hesitation and strengthen confidence. The brain becomes more comfortable expressing ideas, and speaking begins to feel more natural. With regular practice, English stops feeling like a subject to study and becomes a simple tool for sharing thoughts and experiences. Chapter 11. How fluent speakers unlock their words. Fluent speakers often appear relaxed and confident during conversations. Words seem to come naturally and sentences flow without long pauses. Observing someone speak English fluently can sometimes make it seem like their brain works differently. In reality, the difference usually comes from the way their mind has learned to process language. Fluent speakers have trained their brain to unlock words quickly and allow ideas to move smoothly into speech. The key difference lies in how the brain organizes language. Fluent speakers do not search for individual words one by one. Instead, their brain stores language in patterns and phrases. When they want to express an idea, the mind selects a group of words that already belong together. This process allows sentences to appear faster because the brain is not building every sentence from the beginning. Another important habit of fluent speakers is focusing on communication rather than perfection. Their goal is to express ideas clearly, not to produce flawless grammar every time. Because of this mindset, the brain feels less pressure while speaking. When the mind is relaxed, it allows language to flow more easily. Fluent speakers also trust the vocabulary they already know. They do not stop speaking just because they cannot find the perfect word. Instead, they use simpler words to explain their ideas. This flexibility allows conversations to continue without long pauses. The brain learns that communication can still succeed even when the language is simple. Listening plays a major role in how fluent speakers unlock their words. Through years of exposure to natural conversations, the brain becomes familiar with common expressions and sentence structures. These patterns become stored in memory, making it easier for the mind to form responses quickly. Another factor is the habit of thinking directly in English. Fluent speakers often form their ideas in the same language they are speaking because their brain does not translate from another language. The response appears faster. The connection between thought and speech becomes direct and efficient. Practice also plays a powerful role in unlocking words. Fluent speakers have spent many hours speaking, listening, and interacting with the language. Each conversation strengthens the brain's ability to recall words and organize sentences. With enough repetition, this process becomes automatic. Confidence is another element that helps unlock language. When someone believes they can communicate successfully, the brain becomes more willing to release words. Fear or self-doubt can block this process, but confidence allows ideas to move forward without hesitation. Fluent speakers also remain comfortable with pauses. Instead of panicking when they need a moment to think, they allow their mind a brief pause and continue speaking calmly. This relaxed attitude helps the brain maintain control of the conversation. Another important habit is using familiar sentence structures. When the brain has practiced certain patterns many times, it can reuse them in different situations. This allows the speaker to create new sentences quickly while still relying on familiar language. The brain becomes very efficient at retrieving words. Vocabulary that was once difficult to remember becomes easy to access. The mind recognizes situations, selects appropriate phrases, and organizes sentences without conscious effort. Learning from fluent speakers can help others improve their own speaking ability. By focusing on communication, practicing common patterns, and building confidence, the brain gradually develops the same habits. Unlocking words is not about having a perfect memory or knowing every rule of grammar. It is about training the brain to trust its knowledge and allow language to flow naturally. As the brain gains experience using English in real situations, speaking becomes smoother and more comfortable. The speaker begins to notice that words appear more quickly and conversations feel easier to manage. The mind no longer struggles to find language. Instead, ideas move naturally into sentences, allowing communication to happen with clarity and confidence. Chapter 12. The moment your voice finally speaks English. There comes a point during language learning when something begins to change inside the mind. The experience can feel subtle at first, yet it marks an important shift in the way the brain uses English. Instead of carefully searching for words or translating thoughts, sentences begin appearing more naturally. The speaker notices that ideas move from the mind to the voice with less effort. This is the moment when the voice finally begins to speak English in a more natural way. This change does not happen suddenly, like a switch turning on. It develops gradually as the brain becomes more familiar with the language. Through repeated listening, thinking, and speaking practice, the mind slowly builds stronger connections between ideas and English expressions. Each time the brain forms a sentence successfully, it strengthens these connections. Over time, the process becomes easier. During earlier stages of learning, the brain often works slowly when trying to speak. A person may understand English clearly, but still struggle to respond quickly. Thoughts may form easily in the mind, yet expressing them aloud feels difficult. This stage is normal because the brain is still building the pathways needed for speaking. With regular practice, these pathways become stronger and faster. The brain begins recognizing patterns of language more easily. Instead of searching for individual words, the mind starts using familiar phrases and structures that have been practiced many times. These patterns help the brain create sentences more smoothly. Something interesting begins to happen. The speaker may notice that certain thoughts appear directly in English without effort. The mind no longer feels the need to translate ideas from another language. Words seem to arrive automatically as soon as the idea forms. This is a sign that the brain has started thinking in English. When this connection becomes stronger, speaking feels more comfortable. The voice begins expressing ideas more freely because the brain trusts the language it already knows. Even if a perfect word cannot be found, the mind quickly chooses another way to communicate the idea. Confidence also grows during this stage. The speaker realizes that communication is possible even without perfect grammar or advanced vocabulary. Simple sentences are enough to express thoughts clearly. This realization reduces the pressure that once slowed down speech. Another noticeable change is the reduction of long pauses. The brain becomes faster at forming responses because it has practiced the process many times. Conversations begin to flow more naturally, and the speaker feels more engaged in the interaction. This moment often feels encouraging because it shows real progress. The person begins to see that all the listening, practice, and repetition have helped the brain adapt to the language. What once felt complicated now begins to feel more familiar. This moment does not mean the learning process is finished. Language continues developing with further practice and experience. Each conversation strengthens the brain's ability to communicate clearly and confidently. The important part of this stage is recognizing that the voice is no longer silent. The brain has learned to release English words more easily, and speaking becomes a natural extension of thinking. When the voice finally begins speaking English comfortably, the experience can feel empowering. The speaker realizes that fluency is not about knowing every rule, but about allowing thoughts to flow through the language. This moment represents the reward for consistent effort and practice. The brain has learned how to connect ideas with words, and the voice is ready to share those ideas with others. Conversations become opportunities to grow rather than situations to avoid. As the journey continues, the connection between thought and speech becomes even stronger. English begins to feel like a natural tool for expressing ideas, emotions, and experiences. The voice speaks with greater ease, and communication becomes an enjoyable part of everyday life. Your brain already knows more English than you think. The words, the ideas, and the understanding are already inside your mind. The challenge was never about learning more vocabulary. The real challenge was teaching your brain how to release those words naturally when it is time to speak. Throughout this training, you have practiced reconnecting your thoughts with your voice. You have started building the pathway that allows ideas to move directly from your mind into spoken English. Every time you practice thinking in English, forming simple sentences, and speaking without overthinking, your brain becomes stronger and faster. Speaking fluently is not about perfection. It is about allowing your thoughts to flow naturally without fear or hesitation. The more you train your brain this way, the easier it becomes for your voice to express the English that already exists inside you. Keep practicing daily. Keep turning your thoughts into English sentences. With time and consistent training, the silence between your brain and your voice will disappear, and speaking English will begin to feel natural and effortless. Continue strengthening your English brain, and your fluency will keep growing every single day.